Hello and welcome everyone to today's event. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies, where I'm also professor of anthropology and Middle East Studies. And it's my great pleasure to host today's event, Dina Georgis, and we're going to mainly focus on her book, The Better Story, Queer Effects from the Middle East. Hello, Dina, welcome. Dina Georgis is an associate professor at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Her work, which is situated in the fields of postcolonial, gender and sexuality studies, examines how aesthetic and cultural expressions are also effective responses to political and social urgencies. Her first book, and having a copy here, and I very much recommend it. I enjoyed it. It's an amazing read. So her first book, The Better Story, Queer Facts from the Middle East, which was published 2013, turns to story as a method for thinking about how those affected by colonial traumas and losses narrate their survival. Dina's writing appears in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, and Studies in Gender and Sexuality. She's presently working on a monograph provisionally entitled Making Use of Objects, Play and Radical Witnessing of War and Conflict. This project explores what it means to ethically witness others not as noble, often dehumanized, objects, but as engaged subjects composing themselves and their surrounding worlds in acts of play as they make use of resources from everyday life. It views play as creative capacity made through pleasure, curiosity, and interest. Focusing on one conflict in the MENA region, this work demonstrates that the outcomes of play not only have personal implications, but social and political ones as well. So the structure of today's event will be Dina and myself being in conversation for about 40 minutes or so, and then we have time for discussion, and I encourage everyone to use the Q&A function to put your questions or comments. So welcome, Dina.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great. So your book very much resonates with me on different levels, not only because of the Iraqi connection, but before delving into the ways you approach narrative in your book, I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your personal trajectory as it links to the book.
Yes. I think I say at the start of the book that it's taken a lifetime to write this book. I say that because this book is very much about my own personal journey, and arriving at this book took I had to digress in different places, I would say, before I got there. And some of those digressions involved writing about trauma and diasporic displacement in a more generic sense, not really focusing on the Arab world. And before that, I was, just reading continental philosophy and literature. And so it really took me quite some time to get to this book, mostly because of the vulnerabilities that are involved in the content of the book, which has to do with experiences of leaving Iraq under conditions that were not completely known to me at the time. I was just an infant arriving in Lebanon, and not that long after our arrival, civil war started, and it just set off a more series of displacements. So when you experience trauma, which is the subject of this book in a lot of ways, it takes time. It takes time to talk about it. And how you talk about it is really significant. I begin the book with a preface with my narrating my niece's dream, which, at the end of that preface, I say this is really about me, not my niece. And her dream is about her grandfather and my father. He had died at that point, and she dreams of him in a very sort of very, very graphic image of dead bodies, like in lines, almost like an image from it's a kind of death camp, And so I was really struck by why she would, why her brain would go there, and it became, I would say, an affective site for me to really kind of unpack transgenerational trauma, the struggle with remembering your origins, the secrets that you live with, and how you arrive at trying to kind of work through all of that. And what narrative, and then our relationship to narrative itself. Why is narrative so important when it comes to surviving difficult experience? And so it was a really kind of rich moment in I guess in the history of my intellectual thinking, when I don't really remember all the details now, and how it all happened, and how my niece Sarah told me this dream, but I know it was really, I remember it being really significant, and it didn't necessarily frame the book, but it provided me an avenue to really unpack all the layers of what the book is about, which is the struggle with knowability. How do you understand political histories that you are not directly accessible to? How you inherit them? What it means to carry the narratives of your parents, and what do you do with those narratives, and how does the story keep evolving, if you will?
Yeah, I was intrigued by the title of your book, The Better Story. So you write in your book that every story is a better story, or the best possible story we have invented to allow ourselves to go on living. So rather than being interested in content alone, you seem to look at narratives in terms of the work they do for us emotionally and psychologically, especially in the context of collective trauma and also what you call transgenerational haunting. And I wonder whether you can maybe elaborate a little bit on that concept as well. But I guess my main question here is the title of the book. Why the better story? What does it signify?
So the better story, that phrase comes from Jan Martel's novel, The Life of Pi. And in the preface of his book, he talks about his process of arriving at the idea of his book. He had met, he says, a man in South India who told him that I'm going to tell you a story that will make you believe in God. And so the story involves, if you haven't read the novel, it's a story really of migration from India to Canada. That involves a shipwreck and the loss of most of the animals. This is a family that owned a zoo back home, and the loss of all the animals. And it's a story about a boy who ends up with a tiger and some other animals on a boat, and they miraculously arrived to Canada and survived. So it's a magical story. In that story, the tiger and the boy learn how to live together, and rather than the boy working against or in a defensive relationship with the tiger, he learns how to be with the tiger in ways that allow both their survival. It's a beautiful story. It's magical. It's probably not true, but it's a story that allowed him to survive and get through that experience. When the boy ends up in Canada with the authorities, he tells them that story. The authorities don't believe him, and then so he tells them another story of human devastation, greed, tragedy, which is more believable. But he said, which would you rather believe, the story with the tiger or the story of like human devastation and greed? And of course, it's the story that makes you believe more in God and in magic. So the premise of this book is really about that all of our stories, especially when they have to do with traumatic experience, is our capacity to create something that allows us to survive. In a lot of ways, that the relationship between fiction and reality is one that is, it's a blurry one, because when you're traumatized, all you can do is, it's very difficult to claim the experience. So all you can do is imaginatively construct your life. And so the premise of the book is, how have we imaginatively constructed our lives in post colonialism, post-slavery? What are our emotional resources? What are the emotional resources that go into constructing our survival that allow us to survive well? Now, the thing about the better story is, I argue, and this is not in the novel so much that I take this phrase from, but the better story doesn't always end up being the best possible story, and that sometimes we outlive that story and that we need to move on. And so the better story always needs to remain a living thing, that we need to constantly reconstruct and reconstruct imaginatively our lives. Otherwise, we get stuck in discursive constructs that may not serve us well. And the way that I often explain this to my students who have a hard time understanding why a story is not going to work so well, is the story of Israel. Actually, the story of Israel is born from tragedy of the Holocaust, and it's a story now of creating enemies, of being reactionary, of being defensive, of creating walls, of creating an other to create a sense of belonging within the walls of Israel. So sometimes our stories are not so great, they're not that magical, but the principle is the same thing. And so I try to sustain that tension in the book, that yes, we have stories and we need them, but we also really need to reflect on our stories, because sometimes, one, they don't serve us well, or they actually can hurt other people as well. So story for me is a method to both be generous about the stories that come out of conflict, war, and trauma, but also to be critical, because you wouldn't want not to be critical of the stories of Israel, even though it's based on, I would argue, their survival. And one of my chapters in the book is about the survival of Jewish people through the construct of Israel. So that if there's nothing else that one can learn from my book, it's that this is the message that I would like people to understand, is that this paradox of human creativity and imagination that can both invigorate our lives, but also can be, contribute to our demise in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I have to say, and I don't know what you think and feel about this, Dina, but although, you write specifically, your examples, the case studies that you look at are taken specifically from the Middle East, and you're focusing on war and conflict, and clearly colonialism and the post-colonial condition framing your book. But I feel that, there's something so timely about your book as well, because I somehow I have the sense that this is a moment when so many of us, collectively and individually, are asking ourselves, are we telling ourselves the best possible story? I do think that COVID has done something about that, in terms of, the role of nation states, the role of, working together. And of course, migration is such a big issue as well. So I don't know if you have any reflections on that, in terms of, some of the underlying meanings that you said. The one thing that I want people to take away from, how has become really, really acute again. There's always that, of course. And as you mentioned the example of Israel, and then, we, of course, also an example of Iraq and so many, Lebanon, but the sort of wider, beyond the Middle East resonance. Have you thought about that in the current context?
I'm just wondering what you're thinking of, Nadia, in terms of the the story that we've told ourselves about COVID. I'm just wondering particularly what you're thinking of here in terms of the narrative we've created.
Well, I guess it's the narratives I'm thinking about are narratives about, borders and nations. Like right now, people are, again, trying to protect themselves, or, governments are trying to protect themselves by closing borders, while, scientists, the WHO is telling us that it's not going to help. We need to collaborate. We need to think collectively. We have to think beyond the nation state. And I just feel that both on the level of, and then there's climate change as well, there are just so many things happening that forces us to rethink the story, both on a collective level, but also I feel individually, many of us, certainly myself, think, have to kind of really be more reflective about the kinds of stories just to keep going, I don't know, I just feel this moment that's kind of opening up lots of possibilities.
Yes. So I think I know what you're getting at. I think that in some ways it's an old story of putting up borders and reimagining the terms of belonging and safety and protecting us as opposed to them, and thinking in very small-minded ways around how to deal with a global situation. The irony and the paradox is that we also create these stories in terms of our, nation states here around what COVID has done for us. It's opened our hearts to kindness. We have become good neighbors. We are taking care of each other. And in some ways, it really is a repetition of the narratives that are not really new. It's exactly a story about nationalisms and caring for ourselves and not the others. That doesn't, and even though we hear this over and over again from the WHO and other places that we need to actually open borders. We need to think across nations to figure out this the situation. I think so. This is where I think the theory of the book also comes in, is that. And this is I guess this is my more generous read of us kind of clamping down and closing borders. Not that I approve of that or agree with that, but when we feel unsafe, it's almost like we are hardwired to cling more and belong more. And this is the danger of actually culture and narratives of belonging, is that our fear, our dependency on the other, puts us in a position where we bond, and when it's really bad, as Jacqueline Rose says about Israel, we bond on hate. But we don't have the stories of bonding on hate. We have the stories in the present moment of bonding to take care of each other during COVID, and look at all these ways in which community has evolved. But it's only evolved within the borders of our nation states. It hasn't evolved outside it, because, and I think it hasn't, mostly because when we feel danger, we tend to tighten the doors. We lock the doors even harder. So I think, I haven't really quite thought of it until you mentioned it, to be honest, I think it's a really interesting way to think about why we just affectively, emotionally can't even get there, right? Because we're too threatened to let those borders open. Yes. Yeah. Thanks. So there's one thread that I also noticed in your book that resonated again quite a bit, which is that thread, that the tension between the collective stories and the individual stories. I was grappling with that a lot when I did my work on the oral histories and stories of Iraqi women. And I was often struck by this tension, that the first, especially when you would first speak to a woman, I was very conscious that the story I would get would be the collective story often linked to either sectarian identity or class identity. But then there is the individual one. And so I was just wondering if you can tell us a little bit how that relationship plays out in your work. Well, there's no easy way to, I
Mm,
think, explain the individual as the individual is connected to the collective. I mean, I think these are entangled relationships. The story of the human, at least from my psychoanalytic lens, is that we are made through each other. That we our dependency on each other means that we need to accede to to culture, the narratives of belonging of our own milieu and context. And so the relationship of the self as a singular human being with the collective are completely entangled. What allows me to understand singularity for me is what I call queer affect. So I guess that's where that kind of concept is important to our discussion. But before I go there, that's not to say that our relationship to collective narratives as they are passed down through our immediate context, like family and whatever. That's not to say that we don't have different relationships to those collective narratives. Of course, we all do, and that's a complex relationship that I can't really, it's unique to each human being. But there is no human being that is not made by the collective narrative. No, none of us are. We are cultural animals. There's no way we are not. So those collective narratives are really significant to who we are, and they are entangled in a very complex back and forth relationship to the outside world. But so this is why queer affect also functions in the Better Story as also a method to understand how can we identify, how can we listen to humans when those collective narratives are not really effectively helping us live our lives well. And for me, that comes through in listening to the queer affect of those narratives, be they collective narratives or be they an individual human being talking about their lives. But this thing that I call a queer affect is the ways in which we are not completely knowable to ourselves, and the ways in which we don't really understand even why those narratives became appealing to us to begin with. And the reason why I've always focused, I suppose, on fiction and story and the visual or even music, is because it gives you those, or dreams for that matter, that those contexts give you access to get to what can't be directly said, to think about where people collide and conflict with those narratives in ways that are very, very individual. And now, I say in the book that queer affects have resonance that are larger than just the personal, and I can give you examples of those later. But it's, I don't know, Daddy, if you've maybe noticed in your interviews where somebody will give an interview and maybe they'll pause or they'll stumble or they'll contradict themselves, or those to me are the most important moments in an interview where the assumed because we're not original as human beings. We reproduce what we've learned, but there are moments where we don't do that. And to me, those are really extremely interesting moments because they come from somewhere else. They come from our history, in our experiences that we haven't completely processed, but they're living in us, in our bodies, and they come out. I'm saying in narrative, even in an oral history. So what does it mean to have if you're a researcher, how do you talk about those moments? And to me, I've been very scared of interviewing people for that very reason, because how do you give voice to those moments, because when those individuals are not even recognizing that they're in those moments to begin with. And so I've always turned to fiction and narrative and films to understand how we live in excess of what we know. And when we get to those places of unknowability, it opens up possibility for me. It opens up, we get to the kind of the unconscious of the people. And in my book, I argue that the Arab Spring was a moment of that. You know, people were kind of went out to the streets because they were frustrated that the terms of belonging were no longer working. You know, and I say at the end of the book that those slogans that you saw in Tahrir Square were just a frustration. They were just affect. It's just, we don't want this anymore. We you know, it was just kind of raw frustration that and I talk about that in terms of not necessarily just resistance, because resistance has narrative, discursive, it comes with a package, ideological package. But for me, revolt is something that is just, it exceeds a narrative sense, and it in that moment, I always see hope and possibility. That's, now, of course, we have seen the outcomes also of that moment in history, that they're not necessarily all that we want. But I still strive to look for those moments, because I think they're an occasion for making change. In a lot of ways, change has also happened. So I'm sorry, I've kind of digressed.
No, it's okay. A lot of strands here that I want to pursue. Okay. I mean, I want to go back on, you know, the narrative as potentially generating better political futures, thinking about the, you know, protesting the so-called Arab Spring. I have to say I have a big problem with that term, not just, you know, in terms of the spring metaphor, but I feel it's time to, especially, I guess, if you try to queer the Middle East, and I think we also have to be careful about the way we use Arab, because I mean, I have to say, in the context of my work, in 2011, I was in the north of Iraq, and it was the Kurds who were mainly out protesting, you know, and they didn't feel so so happy about the term as all other ethnic minorities in the region. But anyway, that's slightly before I like to sort of pursue this idea of the narratives as being emotional resources for learning, but also for generating better political futures. I actually want to go back to the idea of queer effect, because that is an important concept for you, and a concept method as well. And I'm conscious that not everyone who will be watching or listening to us today might be so familiar either with sort of the affective turn and also queer theory, and how I know you mentioned it, but I was wondering if you can sort of try to elaborate a little bit more what you mean by queer effect. And then you seem to be particularly interested in queer pain. So if you can talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, it's a big one to kind of explain in a few words, but I will try my best. I mean, there's a lot of ways to think about the ways in which we live in excess of what we know. You know, I'm not the first person to think about, you know, unknowability, the way we exceed knowledge even in our everyday lives. But for me, I used the word queer to think about, you know, our relationship to what we don't know, because what we don't know is also, it can be scary. It is dangerous. It is something that we feel. I argue in the book that it's libidinal. It is sexual. So these are all affects that I think every human being experiences, and it's about what, and some of us, but it's about what is it that we do with those feelings when we, you know. So, but queer as a concept is interesting because I guess its history is that the dangerous sexualities have been repudiated, that they're too dangerous, so we've pushed them away, and the queer movement was about reclaiming those experiences, reclaiming danger, and not feeling afraid. So for me, it worked as an interesting metaphor to think about what where culture and society can't cope with seemingly dangerous affects or experiences of sexual being or embodiments, or ways in which human beings want to live in excess of culture and dogma. And so it kind of, for me, it worked, it brought in all those ways to think about our relationship to danger, to unknowability, to the legacies of trauma that baffle us, in a nicely kind of, it's a concept that people can connect to as well, queerness. So it's both queer as a lived experience of marginality, but queer as something that is dangerous, unknowable, and scary. And the legacies of trauma are also unknowable and scary. So I think it just kind of worked really well to bring that idea in a way that I think is just familiar and concrete for people, because queerness is something that has become something that people attach to. Of course, the problem with a concept that people attach to is that they still want to see it as an identity. And in the book, I try really hard to say that it is an identity, but it's also something else. So when we think of queerness as affect, not as identity, it speaks to something else. I mean, we arrived at queer affects with queer identity, but but it's more than that. So I don't know if that helps to.
Yeah, I think so. I think that really clarifies it. But now maybe then the second part in terms of queer pain, because that's quite central to what you're doing.
Yeah. So I mean, where queer pain comes up in the book is really around sexualities in the Middle East, it's the history of sexuality, contemporary sexuality in the Middle East is one that is very much fraught, as we know. I write in the book that in contexts where in the region there's a way in which anti-imperialism sentiment has needed its has required that people live by tradition as a way to communicate anti-imperialism, because queerness has been associated with the Western world. And so I talk about the way in which that has been is a painful burden for people who identify as queer, or don't even identify as queer, but have same-sex desire. So so in terms of the real lives of queers, there's, I think, both things are at work. They live as monsters, and depending on the context that they live in, to their community, and their affects, their own affects feel monstrous to them as well. So it's, but beyond queer sexualities, any kind of relationship to, I guess, your own relationship to trauma and the affects and the legacies of that, I would also call as queer pain, if it keeps haunting you. It's that invisible matter in your life that can't be quelled. So metaphorically speaking, queer pain is not necessarily just connected to sexuality. It's also the kind of pain that is where we feel we're strangers to ourselves, because we can't quite understand the source of that pain. I mean, I would say that that all of my intellectual writing uses my queer pain, and I'm talking here not just about my sexuality, even though I'm queer identified, but it has become, not understanding my origins, the displacement has become a resource for me to write and to be creative. So yes. So when you're especially in contexts where in the diaspora where you're displaced, you're always in a relationship to pain. It doesn't ever end, and that doesn't mean necessarily we really understand that pain. But for me, it's become a resource for creativity and for intellectual thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So this year I'm running this lecture series on queering the Middle East. And I mean, what I've noticed is that much of the more recent scholarship that is taking a kind of queer, analytical, methodological, political approach is really, and focusing on the Middle East or its diasporas, is really moving away from focusing on sexuality as, I mean, I guess sort of similarly in the way that I would say feminist, you know, you don't necessarily have to focus on women or gender when you do feminist research, but it's more a lens. And so what I've seen, the readers very creatively using queer. So for instance, last couple of weeks ago, I was in conversation with Sima Sherzari, and she is very much using queer in relation to the state, failed states. And then Rassan Mosawi, you know, focusing on Lebanon, very much focusing on conflict and this constant state of conflict and chaos as queer. And then, of course, there's Maya Mekdashis and Jasbir Puar who are also speaking about this. Yeah. So do you see yourself also as contributing to that body of scholarship that is trying to not redefine, but is trying to theorize queerness in relation to the Middle East and its diasporas without being US-centric as much of the, I would say, queer studies, even queer of color theory tends to be?
Yeah. So, you know, I've been trained in queer theory, so I have an attachment to it, but I'm also wary of it for some of the reasons that you've just mentioned, Nadia. One of the ways in which, you know, I think in a lot of ways queer theory is still too committed to you know, defiance in simplistic ways. It's too celebratory. It's too invested. I mean, there's critiques of coming out narratives for sure, you know, but it's really invested in not feeling shame, in resistance, in defiance, in being in, you know, and in ways that I think that a lot of people from our region can't identify with, to be perfectly honest. And so I wrote a piece on queer Arab shame some time ago, and I focused on a group of queer women who wrote a book called Parid Mistajel, and it was the stories of mostly women and trans people, who lesbians and queer identified people who are telling their stories. And what I noticed in those stories is that a lot of those women were identifying with the nomenclature of the Western world, lesbian and gay and queer, but they were also telling another story about their relationship to their region and to shame and to their families. And they were telling stories where coming out is not an option, because the stakes of their lives are connected to belonging to their family and to their culture and to their context. And so I like to think about, I mean, I try to make queer as a concept both a thing that can speak to their experiences of marginality and pain, but also because they choose to use Western terminology to also honor that. So I don't want to actually not talk about queerness or queer theory, since those very people, I mean, there's that community needs those terms too for their own survival. So my relationship to queer theory is both subjectless, like a lot of the people who are talking about it, in terms of it being a way to think politically, a way to think affectively, a way to think, to even use it through our, as a way to think about decolonization, but also to honor it in the lives of people. Yeah. Yes. So I don't really want to reduce it to one thing. And I think in my book, I try not to do that. It is an identity that we should be suspicious of, but we still care about. It is an affect that feels dangerous. It is something that people need and reach for, but we also need to problematize.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I should say that article in Kohel, I think it's fantastic. And I've been using it in my classes, and students really enjoy it as well. And maybe this is a good time to plug. So the journal that Dina published that article in, for those of you who are interested in writings by mainly queer feminist, both academics, but also researchers in the Middle East, but also in the diaspora, is Kohel, a Journal of Body and Gender Research, which is an online journal that exists both in English and Arabic, and it's freely accessible online, and is producing really interesting body of knowledge production that is very interesting, very original. So Dina, before I'm going to ask you my next question, I'll just want to pause for a moment and encourage the audience. So if you have any questions or comments, please put it into the Q&A function. So I mentioned before, I'm interested in the way that you approach narrative as an emotional resource for learning, but also for generating better political futures. And so I was wondering if you can give some concrete examples of narratives doing that work, being emotional resources, but also offering the potential for better political futures. And then you speak about the need to unlearn what you call worn out responses to war and conflict. So how do we do that? How do we unlearn worn out responses to war and conflict, and how do narratives provide us with new insights potentially?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a more recent work that I did thinking about Hani Abu Assad's film Arab Idol, and in that film the film is based on a young man from Gaza winning the Arab Idol competition. It's a very dramatic story where he manages to cross the border and gets to Egypt, and it's like a rags to riches kind of story. It is. It's sort of like wild that it happened, but it actually really did happen. But Abu Assad's question to himself is, why did, like, not just the Arab world, but why did Palestinians, why were they so excited by this? Why were they so drawn to this young man who made it? What was that about? So he made a film to explore that. And so my read of this film got me thinking about, as we all know, that for Palestinians, resistance and resilience is everything. It is so much part of the history of Palestinian cinema. It is so much part of the literature. It is really everything, and it's a really important part, obviously. But it made me think of what else do, especially people from Gaza, what do they want? So did I say he was from Gaza? He was from Gaza. So what is there something else that Palestinians and particularly people from Gaza want? And it seemed to me in that moment where that all Palestinians were hovering around their TV sets watching, I forget now his name, Asaf, I forget his first name, is a moment in Palestinian history that spoke to what I say is joy, is pleasure, is bonding on something else other than pain. Actually, it's about being proud, and it made me think about what does it mean for those of us who care about the situation in Palestine, for not intellectuals, activists. What would it mean to attend to that part of their humanity in terms of supporting Palestinians? And speaking of plugs, I'm going to plug something that I was involved with recently, which is called Queer Cinema for Palestine. This is an initiative that was initiated by Packby and John Grayson here from Toronto, filmmaker, to produce a digital festival for Palestinians, for queer Palestinians. And it was a huge success. It was merely to offer, it was an offering of, it was about connection, it was about taking pleasure in queer Palestinian cinema, but also offering cinema to Palestinians. And so while resistance is really important, and the terms of resistance, I think needs to always change, because I think we do get too settled into the ways in which we resist. There are other ways that we can bond that might open up possibilities of new ways of being, and even and new ways of imagining political futures. I don't know what those things are. In my work, I don't really think about how people should live their lives differently. I just look for the cracks, if you will, for the moments where I see people wanting something that is beyond what they normally seem to want or say what they want. Mm-hmm. And even though this moment in Gaza and in the West Bank was a moment of like, people would say, oh, but that's just like, there you go, there's Western imperialism again, like idol is a Western product. And here they are like going gaga over something that is from the West. It's a resource. What was available to them? It gave them joy, it gave them a sense of pride. And so what does it mean for activists and intellectuals to, seize that moment and really think about it, and how will it inflect our activism? And I would say, in this moment of Queer Cinema for Palestine, this event that we created it's a festival that was of many cities. So we had like all these satellite locations, each curating their own little festival that was accessible to everybody. It was just beautiful. So that's to me that was about giving pleasure and a connection through different terms. And feeding the soul, if you will. Yeah. And so it produced a different kind of activism in my mind. So it's not a big example, but it's something. It's just about attending to something else. It's breaking out of the patterns of how we think we can be activists and be allies, and doing something new. I would never, having grandiose ideas of new futures, I think will lead us nowhere. I think it's about seizing moments. It's in the minutia. It's about attending to how people are already changing, because people are always experiencing their queer affects and making new meanings from them. And it's about attending to those meanings. And as researchers, it's about listening and saying, what is really going on here? Are people wanting something else? Or will we keep imposing the same ideological perspectives over and over again? And in the book, I say that resistance itself, the way we've imagined it, has become ideological because we can't go outside the construct. And it's very much about emancipation. And I use David Scott to say, like, we're in some ways, it's actually a very colonial construct.
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering, as I'm listening to you now speak about your more recent work. So I understood reading your book that so you were critical of the kind of post-colonial studies impulse to focus on resistance and liberation, and you also seem to be interested in terms of studies of affect to challenge what you call cultures of happiness.
Yeah.
And, the cultures of happiness that gloss over sadness, mourning, and loss. And so on the one hand, you're doing that, and then also, the sort of challenging post-colonial studies that focus around resistance and liberation. So that seemed to be sort of the focus of your work, or the framework. But now you're speaking about, in your current work,
Yes.
does that have shifted? Because, I hear play and pleasure. And so can you say something about the shift and what you're doing now in your current work?
Yeah, I mean, in the current work, I'm not emphasizing trauma as much, because I think I really believe that our capacity to create and play is something that is a resource in all of us, regardless of difficult experience. I mean, no human being doesn't suffer and have pain, obviously, but it is turning our attention to the ways in which we are. In some ways, I'm saying that pain and pleasure are in tandem, and that sometimes we are not. That our pleasure is our desire for pleasure just kind of emotes and kind of rips through pain in ways that are not necessarily directly kind of burdened by the legacies of the past. It is just a kind of raw desire for joy. So and I'm influenced by psychoanalytic thinkers who are less interested in, I think thinking more universally about how we that our own journey, that play is how we construct our lives, and it doesn't have to be something that originates in traumatic experience. That this is what we do as humans, and that we always have the capacity to play, although trauma undermines our capacity to play. And so when you see a traumatized people like Palestinians, who are collectively traumatized, have still able to have the capacity to play in a moment where they're literally just playing with Arab idols. To me, that is invigorating, and it is so hopeful, because they're not completely, flattened by trauma, right? That libidinal energy in every human being is there to be awakened, and that's what I loved about it. It kind of brought that up in them, even if it was just a silly little moment. But it tells you about the capacity that people want pleasure and joy, which I distinguish, Nadia, from a culture of happiness that really is about covering over pain. So just to make that distinction, the culture of happiness doesn't want to have pain. It could be about what, like, Sarah Ahmed talks about, which is, assimilating and just covering over stuff and belonging in the worst kinds of ways. And so that's the culture of happiness that all of us are susceptible to, because we need to survive. But that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about joy here that comes from, again, somewhere else, from something that is deeply about what it means to be human, and the ways in which pain is entangled in our capacity to have joy and pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, that's thank you for clarifying that distinction. And yes, I mean, lots of what you say resonates again in relation to Iraq, and where, by the way, the Arab idol or Iraqi idol is also a big thing, and people love it too. Yeah. So unfortunately, we're about to run out of time, but I was wondering whether just the last few minutes you could talk a little bit about the dream. So you're framing, I mean, you start your book with the dream of your niece, and then towards the end of the book, you share with us the dream of a young Palestinian man who is encountering Judith Butler at a public talk. And and you refer to this exchange evoking the metaphor of tarab, which is an Arab term used to denote a feeling of euphoria linked to a musical exchange. So why that dream at the end, and what does this metaphor do in your work? And you'd have 3 minutes.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Oh my God, let me just talk quickly about the euphoric stuff on Tarab. I think I probably just explained by talking about, Arab Idol and Palestinians' euphoric experience of, SF winning 2014 Idol or whatever it was. And it was a moment of connectivity that was not really conscious, but it was there, it was palpable. It was, so I think these are moments that we need to stop and listen to those moments, because they are moments that to me are so important, and they have something to teach us. And if we have the ears to listen and listen ethically without trying to master or over determine what is really happening. So that to me is really important. And nothing like music is capable of bringing us together in ways that are so embodied, but have no words. And yet all of us have that experience of in some ways it's very easy to talk about queer affects through music, because everybody has that embodied experience of what it means to listen to music and have an embodied experience, that it's evocative. So the dream at the end of Better Story was so emotional for me. This young Palestinian man who had a Palestinian principal, and he said they never talked about Palestine because the conflict made, tore even Palestinians apart. We of course we know that there are discourses that everybody, that we all think that every Palestinian participates in, but that is not true. There's diversity, and we don't agree that, there's hegemonic discourses, and then there's painful conflicts, even internally among us. So this dream was about that. He wanted to. I think it was a dream where Judith Butler invites him to sit with his old Palestinian teacher and have a conversation. So it was it was really interesting, because it told the story of what he needs to do. I think, I don't know, that the importance of relationality, the importance of connectivity, but also that there was this intellectual Jewish lesbian queer person who was the person who made this intervention for him, which is complicated, right? She's Jewish, but I think it spoke to allyship too. It spoke to the importance that conversation is so important if we're going to get through the most horrible events of and the worst injustices of lives, that there needs to be conversation. And so to me, it was a moment of that possibility. So it felt hopeful that conversation could happen across difference, and also internally among people of the same group. So it just had this it kind of brought it all together about how significant, what politics needs, what it means to sit at the table and make change. It was a fantasy. It's beautiful. I don't know if this really happens in the world, but it communicated the importance of what it means to sit at the table and have important conversations, not the kinds of ones that happen in Oslo or the ones that are happening right now in Palestine, but the ones that really make a difference.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's something else that I'd really like to mention about the book and your writing more generally. It's very beautiful and very moving, and I am very much looking forward to reading about your new project. So I'm when are you hoping to? Is this do you have some idea?
Oh, don't ask that question now.
Okay. I know. That's anyway.
Not anytime soon, I'm afraid.
Yeah. No, that's a bad question. Sorry.
No.
Bad. Thanks so much, Dina.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed being in conversation with you. Thanks for your time and sharing your thoughts and reflections. And